Most Germans did not expect their country to lose World War I, and many felt shocked and betrayed to learn that its leadership had surrendered. In the aftermath, German Emperor Kaiser Wilhelm renounced the throne and fled to the Netherlands. As revolutionaries fought for control of the German capital of Berlin, a new government formed in a smaller city to the south called Weimar. Almost overnight, Germany had transformed into a democratic republic, which would be known as the Weimar Republic.
The collapse of the monarchy was very important because it created these power vacuums and this grab for power. And these disgruntled youth, hardened youth, came back into German society and Austrian society and were very disillusioned and had known, their primary, formative years were in the carnage of the First World War, the Great War, the war to end all wars. And so they come out of this experience and really bring that to the streets of Germany, to the political culture of Germany. So that kind of combative spirit. A lot of the politicking that's occurring in Germany is in beer halls and in street fights. For a liberal society to function and a democracy to function, there has to be compromise, there has to be civility. And it's not part of that, the birth of democracy in Germany.
Adolf Hitler was among those youth who brought a combative spirit back to the new German democratic experiment. Hitler was an Austrian citizen who had volunteered to fight for the German army. He was in a hospital recovering from a mustard gas attack that had left him partially blinded when he learned of Germany's defeat, and he moved to Munich shortly thereafter.
Hitler is like hundreds of thousands of other Germans, some of them in the army, some of them not, in 1919, disturbed by their nation's defeat, deeply unsettled by the political revolutions that occurred at roughly the same time, and looking for an answer. He found it in a political organization that already existed, called the German Workers' Party, and he rapidly became a dominant figure in the movement because he had a gift for public speaking.
In early 1920, the party changed its name to the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or the Nazi Party for short.
It was a movement that offered him an explanation for Germany's defeat, namely that the nation had been sold out, that it was not his fault as a former soldier that Germany had lost, but rather seditious forces at home had undercut the war effort, and that explained why Germany had lost. That became the core of his message. And then attached to that was a particular statement that among those seditious forces were the Jews.
Traitors have betrayed us. That's why we lost the war. You need a scapegoat for that. The Jews were a scapegoat.
So that was the beginning, that Hitler blamed this ignominious defeat on his political opponents. And then the peak of this early period of crisis, and from 1918 to 1923, Weimar was plagued with a crisis, was the hyperinflation.
In the great inflation of 1923, you need billions of marks to be able to get a loaf of bread. It didn't pay to work because your money was losing value every hour of every day, and the entire middle class was wiped out.
It's not a coincidence that Hitler attempts to seize power in November 1923, the peak of the hyperinflation. And he sees this as an opportunity that Weimar has become so chaotic, the downward spiral has gone so far, that that's when he undertakes the beer hall putsch.
Hitler and about 2,000 supporters attempted to stage a coup in which they took control of Munich. It ended in a confrontation which resulted in the death of 16 Nazis and 4 German policemen, and Hitler was arrested and charged with treason 2 days later.
The putsch failed. He then was sentenced to jail, but he was treated in jail like a bit of a celebrity and not treated with harshness and not put away for a very long time. In jail, he wrote Mein Kampf, My Battle, My Struggle, which was his blueprint. He told us what he was going to do, and then he did it.
When he came out, he decided that he had to adopt a new and more effective political strategy, one that did not involve challenging the authorities with violence. And he called this actually the legality strategy. He spent most of the mid-1920s building up the political organization of the Nazi Party. But it's important to note that in 1928, at the German parliamentary elections, he got 2.6% of the national vote. In 1924, he had gotten 6%. He was a marginal political figure.
In the mid-20s, the Weimar Republic did very well. Unemployment rate went down. The inflation rate went down. It seemed like Germans were going to be able to move forward with some relative stability and prosperity. And then came the stock market crash of 1929, and that was the beginning of an economic disaster.
What in a calmer time would have disqualified Hitler completely from being taken into the world of acceptability, at this point gained and triggered support from segments of the population.
In 1930, they won 18% of the vote, 107 seats, and then by July 1932, they're up to 37% of the vote.
Now, people knew what Hitler stood for, but they weren't quite sure what his priorities were. We now know in retrospect, looking back, that Hitler was obsessed with two things above all: removing the Jews from Germany, and that became increasingly a murderous program, and he was obsessed with winning what he called living space for Germany in the East. But up until 1932, that's not what he talked about all the time. Indeed, in the last 3 years, between 1930 and 1933, when Hitler's vote was rising the fastest, the Nazis downplayed their anti-Semitic rhetoric. And their rhetoric was, what's wrong with this country is the system. The system is broken. The system doesn't know how to fix what's wrong with this country.
In 1932, Hitler ran against the current president, World War I General Paul von Hindenburg. The Nazis won the largest share of seats in the Reichstag at 37%, but did not get the majority needed for Hitler to become president. In a second round of voting, Hindenburg was able to gain a narrow majority of votes and retain the office.
A third of the electorate gravitated toward Hitler, but it was only a third, and he wouldn't have come to power if it had not been for this powerful elite around the president who said, you've got to pick somebody, let's pick him. And he thus became the person that the president chose to make chancellor.
They believed that they could control Hitler in this way. They called him the drummer, and he was going to head the parade, and the existing elites were going to manipulate him and pass the legislation that they needed, and Germany would be saved, at least saved from communism, from a Marxist dictatorship. And it's one of the great mistakes in all of history.
Now, if we were watching this in class, before this second part, I'd take a moment and I would pause. And I would say, pay attention to the timeline. This is going to happen in 6 months. A lot of times it's hard to see what we can learn from history. Maybe it's a little bit dense, or maybe we're going to have to make a few leaps or something like that. But I think this is one of those moments. We saw it in Italy too, but I think it's even more demonstrable in Germany, where the lesson to be learned is very, very obvious. And the lesson is not so much in this case about Hitler. The lesson is about how fast things can change. 6 months, democracy to dictatorship. When we start to preference being safe, and even more than that, being comfortable over the freedoms that we fought for, over the freedoms that we know were important. When we start to allow things to happen because we don't want to get involved, because we don't know what to do. 6 months. That's all it took. And I don't want us to ever get too complacent that we're terribly far from our own 6-month journey. I'm not saying something's happening 6 months from now. I'm not even saying that this particular pandemic, although it's certainly a watershed moment for this country and for the world, is going to set us off on any sort of path. I'm saying that for the rest of your life, remember 6 months.
Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany in January 1933, but his maneuvering for authoritarian control of the country was not yet complete, nor was his success inevitable.
Hitler's government was fairly fragile at that point. He had been appointed chancellor by the president of Germany, who had appointed and dismissed 3 chancellors in the previous 12 months, and there was nothing stopping him from doing the same with Adolf Hitler. No one really could have anticipated what was to come.
So this is the end of January 1933, and by the end of June 1933, it's a one-party system. And I think that's so important to look at. How do you get from this democracy to a one-party dictatorship in 6 months? It's a combination of the weaknesses of the existing system and opportunities. By opportunities, I mean the Reichstag fire.
February 27th, 1933, the German Reichstag explodes in flame from an arson attack. There's crashing glass, there's twisted steel, there's surging flames. This was an attack on the very symbol of German democracy and was traumatizing.
The Nazis found 3 Bulgarians, put them on trial, and claimed that this was the communist attempt to destroy Germany and destroy the Reichstag. And it gave Hitler the opportunity to draft emergency legislation that Hindenburg signed. It suspended civil liberties, including habeas corpus, knowing why you're arrested. It deputized the SA, the stormtroopers, and made them, effectively a police who could arrest people, arrest enemies.
So they immediately target both the communists, the socialists, male and female state delegates, and often their spouses.
In Bavaria alone, they round up 10,000 people. Now suddenly, the prisons are over capacity. The jails are filled. They're using schools. They're using sports halls.
It led directly to the first concentration camp in Dachau outside of Munich. And so, this was a crucial step in the Nazis' consolidation of power. The Nazis built on this. Most crucially, I think, was the Enabling Act of March 23rd, 1933. And this is when the Reichstag amended the Weimar Constitution. It required a 2/3 vote to do so, and gave Hitler emergency powers for 4 years.
This is a period of time of great violence. People want law and order, calmness and legitimacy. They don't want violence every day, and we've seen in the United States even that whenever there are eruptions of violence, people are prepared to say, we will take law and order and even the sacrifice of some of our basic freedoms in order to what? Eliminate the violence.
So it all seems like, order is being restored from a standpoint of an ordinary German. When you take a peek, and as historians we can look back and look at all these decrees. No, this is the dismantling of democracy, this is the establishment of a one-party dictatorship, and this is the beginning of terror.
After exploiting the chaos of the Reichstag fire and using the law to eliminate democratic checks on his power, Hitler used his newfound authority to go after those he claimed were damaging the social fabric of German society, which included homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, the mentally handicapped, Germans of African descent, and Jews.
April 1st, you have the boycott of Jewish businesses. April 7th, you have the expulsion of Jews from the civil service. May 10th, literally the 100th day in office, you have the book burning. And the book burning, what sets out the idea that Jews have no place in German cultural life. Not only Jews, but people who support the idea of democracy itself.
By July 14th, 1933, Hitler takes a step of banning all other political parties. And suddenly the Nazis, it's a one-party state. And one thinks, okay, so now the seizure of power is completed, but no, not the case.
There's a year interval after that when the principal challenges to Hitler are from inside his own party rather than from outside. He's managed to crush most of the opposition, but within the party there are people who want to proceed even more radically than he does, particularly people in the stormtroopers, the SA, who are interested in acquiring influence over the German military. And so between 1933 and 1934, his principal challenge is how do I manage these people? He manages them in the June of 1934 basically by killing them.
We don't know exactly how many individuals were killed. Most historians now say 200 or more. And it was a really bloody affair. It was not just a purge of the SA leaders who threatened Hitler. Hitler used it as an opportunity to settle scores. And what's so important is that Hitler was completely upfront about this. He went to the public and he said, I'm responsible for Germany, I take responsibility. I have executed these people who I'm charging with treason. I mean, these are extrajudicial murders. These are murders with no trial. It was a way to intimidate the German population, to say, we will use violence if you oppose us.
And that is the coup that puts him finally in power. President von Hindenburg died about a month and a half later, and that meant that there was no one who could effectively challenge Hitler for any power in the state. Certainly no one who could have influenced the army to be opposed to Hitler, and the army was the only force that was still strong enough to have done that.